If you're preparing a vehicle for overlanding, where should you start? Well, let's see what they recommend on YouTube. Use the search facility, we pick the top site here, everything you need to know about overlanding. That sounds good. And they have a dude presenting, and his top tip, you need wider tyres. And by the way, they ought to go onto these fancy alloy rims. Now, I think the recommendation to use alloys is rather controversial. Most serious overlanders would say you ought to stick with your cheap and cheerful but very tough steel rims, like these, in favour of rather fragile alloys. Also, when going to developing countries, you don't really want to be flaunting your wealth. Say in Lagos, where they love a bit of bling, I can well imagine that a set of fancy alloys would fetch about 6 months' pay for the average guy in the street markets. Need I say more? And what about the wider tyres? Well, again, I can't agree with our so-called expert. I stick with skinny tyres, and I do it for 4 reasons: weight, cost, performance and reliability. And I'll tackle these in turn. Now, firstly, weight. Now, the older Defenders were fitted with 750 R16s as standard. I just weighed this one, weighs about 32 kilos. If we go up to something like, say, a 265, that's going to weigh minimum 45 kilos, maybe a bit more, i.e. about another 15 kilos per wheel. Now, I'm not the biggest guy in the world, and I have to say that manhandling those, for me, would be virtually impossible. Well, you can have a laugh here at my expense. Let's see how I manage one of these wheels in practice. It's quite a struggle. I would not want that to be any heavier. The next one is, of course, opening the bonnet. Every time I want to look at the oil or the water, I've got to lift the spare wheel up. The other point to consider is the vehicle GVM, which you mustn't exceed. And if we've got a set of 5 wider tyres, that's easily going to be another 70-75 kilos, and I'd far rather have that available to me as useful payload rather than carry it around as dead load. Now, the next one is cost, and it can be very expensive to fit wider tyres. Firstly, the cost of the individual tyres is going to be greater, but you're also going to have to change the wheel rims, both to accommodate the wider tyres, but also they need a bigger offset to prevent scuffing between the inside of the tyre and the wheel arch. Wider tyres, of course, have larger rolling diameter, and if there's any chance of contact between the tread of the tyre and the inside of the wheel arch, you're going to have to install a suspension lift with all the attendant problems there too. Now, you're going to change the gearing too, and the minimum you have to do is to modify the speedo so that that still gives an accurate readout. You may or may not be happy with the increased gearing, but if you want to retain the original gearing, it means you're going to have to change the internals either of the transfer box or of the 2 diffs. As I said, it can be a very expensive proposition installing wider boots. Off-road performance. Now, the off-road performance of these tyres isn't bad, otherwise the manufacturers wouldn't fit them in the first place. I've done a whole video on this in the technical section on this channel, and I'm not going to reproduce that information here, but suffice it to say, you want nice high-profile tyres, and in this case it's about 100%. The height of the tyre sidewall is about the same as the width of the tread, And it means that when the off-road conditions require it, you can let the pressures down low, you're going to get a long contact area, and it's going to give you low ground pressure. But because the width of the contact area is so small, it means that the external rolling resistance is reduced and is often less than that for wider tyres. The off-road performance is more than adequate for most of the conditions you encounter on an overland trip, unless of course you want to be doing hardcore off-roading. Reliability. If you want to keep your vehicle reliable, you ought to maintain it as close to standard as possible. And one of the worst things you can do in this regard is to fit huge tyres to the vehicle. In my series of videos looking at why axles break on overland trips, I did a case study and I looked at an actual case where a couple had fitted wider tyres and wheel spaces to their Defender, and I found that they reduced the fatigue life in the axles to below 20% of the original value, and indeed they did have the failure in the front axle of their Defender. And this extends to the transmission too. And if you're doing heavy off-roading, you're scrabbling for grip, you're going to be putting much bigger shock loads into the transmission, and sooner or later something is going to break. It isn't my saying, but it's very true. I much prefer to break traction before I break the vehicle. So next question, which tyre manufacturers? My first bit of advice is don't even think about any of the budget manufacturers. I have to say some of their tyres look absolutely great, big chunky black bits of rubber, but they aren't going to last the course and you will regret it if you buy them for a long distance trip. Only go with the premium manufacturers. But in this size the choice isn't great. There are of course the Michelin mud terrains, which I've decided to move away from. I decided to try a set of Avon Range Masters. They have one fatal flaw, and that is that the tread blocks break away and the carcass breaks up prematurely. And I think their owners, Cooper Tire, need to sort this out. I used to use BFG track edges, but no longer made. And hunting around, the best option seemed to be the Goodyear Wrangler Allterrains. And I fitted this set about 2 years ago, and I have to say they are the best all-round tyres I've ever had, and as long as Goodyear keep making them, that is what I'm going to buy. Now when I bought this vehicle, like most ex-military Land Rovers, it came with a set of Michelin XZL mud terrain tyres, like this one. And I just assumed that that's what the vehicle needed. And when the first set wore out, I bought another set. But actually they're not ideal. They're noisy, they're extremely skittish on wet tarmac, high fuel consumption, and also the tread doesn't last that long. So I then decided to see if a set of all-terrains would suit me. And all-terrains make a lot of sense if you're doing expeditions starting in Europe. You've probably got to drive about 2,000 kilometers on tarmac before you do any off-roading. And if you're using the same tracks which are used by the locals, the basic vehicle is so competent in its standard form that it's going to be able to cope. It's only when you get to the really difficult off-road stuff that you have an advantage with the mud terrain tyres. But even then, I am amazed at the competence of a good set of all-terrains. I'll probably use up these Michelin tyres because I have a set, but in practice, in future, I'm only going to be buying all-terrains. Next one, tubeless or tube tyres. Now there's no doubt that these days tubeless tyres are superior, and given a clean sheet of paper, that's what I would use. But I'm not in that fortunate position. I've already got a set of 10 wheels, all tubed, and to get rid of the tyres and the rims is going to be bloody expensive and a big operation. So I'm stuck with what I've got. Now the biggest weakness with tube tyres is that they are prone to punctures. And I've had a hell of a lot of punctures over the years, although the one small upside is that if you do get a puncture, it's quite easy to remove the tyre and replace the inner tube. And I'll tell you the measures I've taken to reduce the incidence of punctures, and although I can't get complacent on this, it would appear I've been very successful over the past couple of years. Now if you're going to run inner tubes, it's very important that you find TT or tube type tyres. Now most stockists these days only stock the tubeless tyres, and they can't normally be bothered to source TT tyres for you, and they'll try and fob you off with the old line, well, you can install inner tubes, no problem. That's a lie. You will have problems, you will have a lot of punctures, so you must insist on TT tyres. I show the inside of a TT tyre. This is one of the Goodyears. It's got a dimpled finish, quite smooth, and providing you ensure that the inside of the tyre is scrupulously clean, not even one grain of sand, and use a bit of talc, and you should have no problems. On the other hand, here's the inside of a BFG tubeless tyre, and this is a real tube shredder. And here we have the inside of one of the Michelin's tubeless tyres. There are a few ribs. Now I think the ribs are just part of the moulding process. I don't think they've actually got any function, and I have a way of dealing with these for use with inner tubes, which I'll show in the next clip. These ought to be removed. It's very simple to do it. You can use a little electric drill and a grinding wheel. You take the ribs off carefully and you just check with your finger to make sure it's smooth. Now it is a lot of work, in particular if you're dealing with a set of 5 tyres, but it's still much less hassle and trouble than having additional punctures when you're out on your travels. Now the quality of the inner tubes has a huge impact on the puncture resistance of the tyres, and if you can find inner tubes made by one of the premium manufacturers, Michelin or Avon in particular, buy them. But they're practically unavailable these days. I'm afraid that the brand which is almost universally supplied in the UK is the Airtight brand. Now when I bought the Goodyear Wranglers, I was supplied with a new set of Airtights, and I had the usual spate of punctures, and I decided to replace them. I did a little inflation test, and about 15 months ago I inflated them all to a given extent. I left them in a stack outside, and look at them today. Absolutely bloody useless. Now most of the 4x4 tyre suppliers in this country couldn't give a damn. They'll sell you a set of inner tubes, job done, they don't want to listen to any concerns or complaints. But I did find one company that was prepared to listen to my concerns and to find a solution for me. A company called Elite Tube and Tyre. Now they don't stock any of the premium brands of inner tubes, but they do a range which come from Poland, which they say are heavy quality. They didn't have them in my size, but they sourced a set at their risk. And I have one of them here. So let's first of all see how heavy they are. I've got one of the Airtights here. That comes in exactly 1 kilo. And if I take one of these, that is 1.8 kilos. So it's nearly double the weight, double the thickness. And that's a very good start. Another important factor. Now these days, inner tubes are often sold to cover a range of different tyre sizes. So the Airtights, for example, they're sold to cover both 7 R16s and 7.5 R16s. It makes it more economical for the manufacturer, doesn't it? But it does mean that if you put one of these tyres inside 7.5 R16, when you inflate it, by the time it touches the tyre, it's already been stretched. The wall of the inner tube is going to be a bit thinner, plus it's also got significant tension inside it, which is going to make it prone to tearing. And this is what I found in practice. When I had punctures, there were often mini tears in the wall. On the other hand, these carrot inner tubes, these are manufactured for 7.5 R16s, and it means that when they are inflated, there isn't going to be this unwanted tension in the wall, and they are going to be more resistant to tearing. And all I can say is that since I installed these about 18 months ago, I haven't had a puncture, and that for me is an absolute bloody record. Now if you're on a long overland trip, it's inevitable you're going to need to deal with punctures on the road sooner or later. If you're running tubeless tyres and it's a small puncture, you can use tyre plugs, no problem. I don't have that luxury, so I've always got to get the tyre off the rim. Now to do this, pair of tyre levers like this, perfectly adequate. I would have that guy off in no time at all. The only advice I would give is important to wear a stout pair of boots, because you do need to tramp the tyre down as you're using the levers. Don't try to do it in a pair of sandals. Of course, before you can use the levers, you've got to break the bead. And there's various tools which are sold for this. Here's one from an overland supplier, but ouch, look at the price. It always seems to me that the overland suppliers sell the most complicated and expensive kit they can. Personally, I wouldn't want to have something so heavy and so bulky, particularly in a very cramped vehicle like this. I prefer something much simpler. A tool like this costs £20 from a tool supplier, not an overland supplier. It comes without an instruction manual, so you've got to figure it out for yourself. If you don't know how to use it, maybe this picture will give you a hint. You still didn't figure it, didn't you? Well, here I am using it in anger. Now the tool I really prefer to use is this guy here, the high lift jack, because I'm already carrying it. But there's a right and a wrong way to use a high lift jack. And to me this is quite the wrong way. Tyre sidewalls are actually quite fragile and easy to damage. So I use the jack with this little guy here, which is a shoe which I made up from a bit of scrap steel. Cost me about £2. The important thing is to remember to put it in close to the rim of the wheel here. You don't want it riding up on the tyre sidewall. And if you do that, you can break the bead in a jiffy, although quite a bit of force is still required to do it. Now the last thing I installed was a TPMS, or tyre pressure monitoring system. As I'm sure you're aware, what this does is it continually monitors the pressure in the tyres, and if you do have a slow puncture, it will warn you that the tyre's going down, and you can catch it before it deflates completely and you shred the tyre. But ironically, since I installed it, I haven't actually had to use it because I haven't had any punctures in that time. But importantly, the version I bought, it supports in fact up to 12 sensors and is longer range, and so I've got sensors on my trailer. And this is very important because with the big trailer you can be driving along merrily, you don't know what's going on behind you, and your tyre can be completely shredding, and this has happened to me in the past. For me, it gives a big peace of mind. Well, that's it. As ever, I seem not to be following the herd. I run standard tyres on this vehicle, whereas everyone else I meet seems to fit big chunky tyres to their expedition vehicles. But so be it, I've given you my reasons. A couple of words of warning, several characters you need to be very careful of. Firstly, the self-appointed expert who recommends that you fit very expensive, often high-tech equipment which you often don't need, and usually for commercial reasons. And secondly, the couldn't care less supplier who just wants to sell you what he's got in stock, whether or not it meets your requirements. My advice is look into it, decide what you want, and then insist on getting it, and don't be talked out of it by people who have different agenda. Bye for now.